This is lesson 4-4, using corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So if you know that two triangles are congruent, then you know that every pair of their corresponding parts is also congruent. So even if I prove two triangles are congruent by, say, side angle side, I just have the two sides and the one angle included between them, the other side and the other two angles are also congruent. So once you know the two triangles are congruent, then you know all of those corresponding parts are also congruent. And we call that CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. And I can actually use that as an abbreviation on the regions. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So what's going to happen in a proof is you're not going to be asked to prove the triangles are congruent. You're going to be asked to prove the corresponding parts are congruent. So first we'll prove the triangles are congruent, and then we're just going to add on one extra step and say that those corresponding parts are congruent, and the reason is going to be CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we're going to look at just two examples. The first one is going to be a flow proof, and the second one is going to be a statement reason proof. So our first example, we're proving parts of congruent triangles. My given says that angle KBC and angle ACB are congruent. So KBC is right here, and ACB, follow the order of the letters, ACB is right up here with the one arc mark. And angle K, two arc marks, is congruent to angle A. So that's my given. So my flow proof, it's set up for me. I'm just filling in either the statement or the reason. So my given is easy because I have two pieces of given, so I'm just going to fill that in. Angle KBC is congruent to angle ACB, and angle K is congruent to angle A. Okay, so I have those two angles. Now, I can never prove triangles are congruent by three angles, so I have to have a side somehow. It's either going to be a side included or a non-included side, so look at my picture. See if there's something I should know. There's nothing else in my given that gives me any information about the sides, but is there anything else I should know about these two triangles? I'm always going to look to see if they share something, and they do. They share side BC right here. So since BC is in both triangles, I'm going to use my reflexive property and say that BC is congruent to BC. So I'll mark my side. Since they share BC, I'm going to mark this right here. BC congruent to BC, I make a little X right there on the shared side, and I'm writing it down, BC congruent to BC reflexive property. Now if you look at what's marked, I can see my two triangles are congruent, and that's going to be the next step. Triangle KBC is congruent to triangle ACB, but what's the reason? Well, let's look. I have my two angles and I have a side. The side's not included, the side's outside, so my reason is my angle-angle side postulate. Now once my triangles are congruent, then the other angle and the other two sides are also congruent by CPCTC. They specifically wanted KB congruent to AC, so that's what I'm writing. KB is congruent to AC, and the reason is CPCTC. Okay, so that's an example of using corresponding parts of congruent triangles. First, I prove my triangles are congruent just like I did before, and I'm just adding one more step. Whatever side or angle corresponding that they wanted, I write it, and the reason is just CPCTC. So I'll do one more example with just a regular proof. Okay, so example 2, AB is congruent to AC. That's already marked on my picture, AB congruent to AC. M is the midpoint of BC. Now whenever I have a midpoint, I like to make a big fat dot there, so I remember that's the middle. M is the midpoint of BC. And if M is the midpoint, then it's cutting BC in half, so I can actually mark that also. So this half, right here, MB, is congruent to this half right here, MC. And since I already used one slash mark for the other two sides, I'm going to use two slash marks here. And we'll start to write that in our proof and then see what else we can come up with. So the given is always step 1. I put all the given together. You can list it separately, but you don't have to. AB is congruent to AC, and M is the midpoint of BC. So that's my given. Now we already marked our diagram. If you haven't, you can do that now. M was the midpoint. I like to put a big dot right there, so I know it's the point in the middle, and it cuts that BC in half, so I already marked those two sides were congruent to each other, but now I'm going to write that as a step. So MB is congruent to MC. Now how did I know that they were congruent? Because M was the midpoint. So that's all. I'm looking at the step right before it gives me the reason for the next step. So the definition of midpoint. Now I don't have any more given. I've used the given. I had a side and I had a midpoint, but I only have two sides marked so far. So this is when I look at my diagram and I say, okay, is there anything else I should know just by looking at it? And look, they share this side right here. Okay, so if they share that side, I'm going to put a nice big X there, and I'm going to write that. That will be my third side, and I'm going to write that as a step. Anytime they share that side, that's my reflexive property. So MA is congruent to MA, reflexive property. Now see how it's nice to have the diagram marked? So now I can see that those two triangles are congruent to each other. So I can write that down, and the reason is side, side, side. I have three sides. So triangle ABC, I'm sorry, I did write ABC, but it should be ABM. Triangle ABM is congruent to triangle ACM. Okay, so let's change that. Triangle ABM, I'm going to change that right here to an M. Triangle ABM is congruent to triangle ACM. And my reason is side, side, side postulate. Now once my sides are congruent, once my triangles are congruent, then I can say my corresponding parts. I wanted to prove that angle AMB is congruent to angle AMC, so I can just do that as the last step. Okay. And I don't know if I wrote my last step, so you guys write the last step, and that would be that angle AMB is congruent to angle AMC, and the reason would just be CPCTC. Okay, and that's it for today.